All right, welcome back. So I know I said that the previous video was going to be the last video of the chapter, but I saw something on my phone, so on Reddit once again, and it inspired me to make one more video. So I wanted to make one more video because I wanted to talk about something that I kind of thought was important. It's not something that came up for me, right, in my debates with atheists, but it was something I saw from someone else who was not debating an atheist, but he was giving like kind of an argument. He was inquiring about a particular argument that was for God or pro-God argument. And there was some responses, well, there was two responses that an atheist gave that made me think, and I wanted to make this video. And I feel that I wanted to make another video, not only to kind of break down that argument he gives, to kind of show how it just fits into everything I've been telling you already throughout the chapter, but I wanted to really give an even more complete sort of structure of the atheist argument, particularly as it applies to rationalist arguments, right? So yeah, that's basically what I want to go over in this video. So the first thing that it says here is that rationalist arguments can never prove God. So that's important, right? So I said before how atheists never come up with new arguments. I've never seen one. And that's actually true for me, right? So in all the debates I've had with them, never seen a new argument. They say the same things over and over and over again. But it's funny, I've actually kind of seen a new argument from one of them, but it wasn't from someone debating me. It was someone else who was giving what I call a rationalist argument for God, which I never did that. So at least I haven't done it recently. When I was a kid, I probably would give slightly a rationalist argument because atheism doesn't make sense from any angle. So when I was a kid, my argument was generally first cause argument, right? None of this makes any sense without, or you could tell that's pretty much a mix between first cause and intelligent design, right? So none of this makes absolutely any sense without a God, which is correct, right? So I recognized that as I was a kid. Of course, they would just say, well, we don't really know what the universe was in the beginning. But you can immediately pivot to the kind of, I call it nested causes or infinite nested causes framework or construct. Sometimes it's called infinity regression. With that construct, you don't have to know the cause. You just need to know that if something affected something else, then there was a cause. You don't need to know about the state itself, the contents of the state itself to make the claim. So atheism makes absolutely no sense from that argument. But yeah, so I was going to say that I don't generally make rationalist arguments. I make scientific arguments on the basis of what you might call semi-empirical data, which we talked about before. But so this guy was making a rationalist argument, and the atheist was kind of breaking down why that doesn't prove God. And like I said, I wanted to make this video. This is almost for other people, right? So now the whole video has been for other people. But what I was doing is deconstructing pretty much putting out the general fallacies in atheist argument and atheist logic. But this is going to be people, and then I told you how to know God, which is through science, right? The same exact process of science that's followed in empirical physical sciences, or the epistemological structure is the same. Right? So if something's objectively true in reality, you can use science to gain information about it, whether it be objectively verifiable or subjectively verifiable. That's the proper approach. And when you say you know something is true, it's relative to that standard, right? And so a rationalist argument, that's the proper way to know God. But a rationalist argument for God is just an argument that's made solely on the basis of the soundness of the argument, right? So a rationalist argument generally would be some argument that makes some observation about reality, which we could say the observation itself, or it makes a supposition as a result of some observation made in reality, right? So we could say the supposition itself seems reasonable based on our observation. However, based on that supposition, right, or that premise, we make a claim that seems to necessarily follow from that initial premise. And if our argument seems airtight enough, right, if it's sound enough, then we could presume it's true, right? That's a rationalist argument. I don't use those to prove God because you can't use a rationalist argument to prove anything, right? It's not science. Like, in other words, there's no way for me to make a rationalist argument. So actually, before I go forward, I should give an example, right? So a rationalist argument might, for example, be, I don't want to go too deep into math. You could say like a vector space, right? You could say in a vector space, if there are members of some particular set, what's called a vector space, all the members, I forgot what they are, I think it's two main properties. All members of a vector space follow two main properties, which I forgot what they are. It's something in parentheses, and actually I think I do remember what it is. I can write it down. But suffice it to say, it's two main properties. All members of a vector space belong to that space, right? So if you distribute, if you multiply it by a scalar, and you distribute it, something like that. There's no point in getting into it, but it's a part of this space, right? So the product is also part of this space, or what it mapped onto. And if that's true, then that's a vector space, right? That's a rationalist argument. So in other words, if that's not a description of reality, reality need not follow as vector space at all. But the argument is if these statements about a particular set of, you just call it members, really vectors, but you can say if there's a particular set and members of that set belong to this space, which we call a vector space, and they all follow these properties, then all of these rules are true, right? Which are all the rules of vector spaces, or a lot of it is studied in linear algebra, like linear independency, linear dependent vectors, and things like that, right? Product spaces and stuff like that. So that is a rationalist argument, right? These are necessary, these theorems and these lemmas are necessarily true if I accept this initial premise, right? Makes no description or makes no claim about reality itself, right? It's purely an intellectual argument. That's how math works, right? Same thing's true, by the way, for complex numbers, right? We know complex numbers for the most part. Well, the imaginary part doesn't, but we know complex numbers are not a complete description of reality because they contain imaginary numbers. But intellectually or rationally, you can still study them from a purely rationalist approach. So my claim is that rationalist arguments can never prove God. They can't, because you can't use a rationalist claim. You can't use a rationalist claim to make an argument about reality. So if I take any physical law, like literally any one of them, like the law of gravity, Newton's laws of gravity, right? Am I really demonstrating the truth value of Newton's laws by a purely rationalist argument? Let's say I never did any experiment on gravity. I don't have a law of, Newton's laws, Newton's three main laws. I don't have any of that. I exist someday way before Newton existed, right, when he was born. Can I rationalize my way to his laws and then justify it based on my rationalizations? I would argue no. Right? Even if I try to, it doesn't really have any value because it's not experimentally verified. Who cares? Right? Like how airtight my logic seemed to be. I can make an argument that's super airtight to say there is no gravity. I can make a rationalist argument for why anti-gravity exists or why cold fusion is possible, and I could go on and on, right? I can make a rationalist argument for why virtual particles make absolutely no sense, right, in particle physics, or why it's impossible for atoms to exist, and it can be super airtight, right? It makes no difference, right? Reality, right, doesn't care for how sound my argument is. It's just, it can easily violate it immediately, right? And we actually see that in science, right? So in science, even the idea of an atom was very hard for people to accept way back in the day, right? It didn't seem to make sense to them, right? It wasn't a rational argument. If someone had came up with a rationalist argument for why atoms exist, who cares? Someone else could have came up with a rationalist argument for why they don't exist. It means nothing. And so rationalist arguments are not a description of reality, right? And that's important because what atheists will, what I wanted to say, before I get into it, atheists are always able to sort of pick apart a rationalist argument solely off the basis that it is a rationalist argument. This is not the epistemological standard you're going to use to say why God exists or that you know God exists, right? You're always going to do it relative to the standard of science. So that's why I kind of want to make this video. That's kind of the thesis of this video. This, and I know this, I never really did this, but I noticed other people do this. So this is for people who would try to make rationalist arguments. So that would be like an argument of first cause, or which first cause is a tiny bit different in design, but you can approach them differently. But yeah, for the most part, I'll just say first cause argument, or intelligent design, or especially ontological argument. Then there's fine-tuning argument, and so on and so forth, which we're going to talk about that in this video. So what I want to do now is I want to look at like I said, this thing I looked up on Reddit. This somebody made a claim to inquire about a particular argument for God. I guess he was curious about the responses from atheists. Then the atheist gave a particular response, which I'm going to show you follows pretty much everything we already said. Follows the fallacies I already told you about, which is virtually in all atheist arguments. But then I'm going to show you kind of the more full and complete structure, which I think applies to, as far as I know, every atheist argument. So I'm going to show you there's three things that every atheist argument does. And I'm going to show you how it makes no sense, it's anti-intellectual, it's anti-scientific, and it's the wrong approach. But it's important to kind of sum up all of their ideas in these three steps, or these three properties, just so you can kind of more easily see through it. I always could see through atheist argument. Well, more specifically, I never thought, I never took them seriously. I always thought they were nonsense since I was a kid. Never, you know what I mean? Never felt like it was particularly difficult to see how they made no sense, right? But, but now I want to just kind of present this so that for other people to kind of have more of a sort of organized perception of why atheism doesn't make any sense. Really, more specifically, that this is what atheists will pretty much do in every single argument. So it's on my phone. Let me pull it up here. So yeah, this Reddit guy was inquiring about fine-tuning argument. So fine-tuning argument for God, which I never even heard that before, but basically, so I looked it up based on this thread, and so my understanding is it basically says that the conditions of life are so, what's the word I'm looking for? Remote, right? So it is so difficult to have the conditions possible for life in the universe. It is so unlikely to exist. It is such a narrow sort of region of, you could say a narrow region regarding the state of a galaxy or solar system, right? That it is very unlikely that our planet would be here right in the Goldilocks zone and this and that, and the planet, our particular planet, would have, cells would be able to develop and life would be able to develop, and then we would be able to turn into complex organisms and have all this intelligence and things like that, which is correct. That's a subset of intelligent design argument, but that's just more of a specific type of version of intelligent design. So that's fine-tuning argument. The conditions that are hospitable to life, especially intelligent life, are so specific and so narrow over the large range of possible conditions that it is more likely to say that there was a guiding hand, right, that enabled that, which of course would be God. And so this guy was inquiring about that. He was actually saying it looks like there's a counter argument to that. So the counter argument is what he calls, I never really looked up, he calls it anthropic principle, or he referred to it as anthropic principle, which the counter argument says that basically in any other universe, no one would be alive, right? So, which I don't really, why would that be a counter argument? But anyway, it says in any other universe, or any other set of conditions which were inhospitable to life, observers wouldn't exist to notice it. So that's kind of the argument, is my understanding. It's only in a universe with these specific conditions that we would exist to notice it, which, I don't understand why it doesn't really address the claim about the narrowness, right? But anyway, is it the claim there that there are multiple universes where nobody exists and then this is the one where we do? I don't know. But that's what they said. But I really want to address what one of the atheists said. So the atheist said, so he first was saying that there are different ways to attack fine-tuning argument outside of anthropic principle. But so what he says, and now I want to see if you can catch what he says that doesn't make any sense, that was an unwarranted claim. So he says, fine-tuning argument as an argument for God rests on the incorrect, which that's not true, but he says it rests on the incorrect assumption that the universe we observe, actually no, that it's kind of true depending on how you contextualize it. But he clarifies it later, which in a way that makes it not true what he's saying. So he says that fine-tuning arguments, argument for God, rests on the incorrect assumption that the universe we observe would be more likely if a God exists. However, this is not true, and it is based on undue assumptions of the kind of universe a God would or would not create. He says a God could have all sorts of wants and aims, and so given a creator God, our universe is not more likely, but less. The sample space of universes a God might create is much bigger than universes obtained from changing the constants in the standard model, which I don't know why he says standard model. That's not really what he's talking about. Particle physics. You can make the fine-tuning argument claim for the state of the solar system, even if you still need an extraordinary conditions to have life just looking at the solar system, let alone particle physics. But anyway, so he says obtained from changing constants in the standard model. So now, I don't know if you caught it, right? So if you heard what he said, he made a claim that goes right into what I was telling you guys. So first of all, he says a God could have all sorts of wants and aims, and so given a creator God, our universe is not more likely, but less likely. Why? How can you make a claim about more or less likely based on God, even if he's a creator? So if he's a creator, our universe is less likely because the sample space of possible universes, I guess, he might create is very, very large. So for him to pick any particular one of them, the probability goes down when the entire sample space or number of, I forgot what they're called. The number of, I don't really do statistics. Are they called random elements? Where the number of possible elements that can be chosen from the set are much higher, right? Is very, very high or very large. Let me just, I think they're actually called random variables. Let me see. I forgot what they're called. I can't believe I forgot that. I used to know it. But anyway, right? So in other words, what he's saying is that like I said, if a God is creator, then the number of total possible universes would be very large. The larger it gets, the more unlikely it is that any one universe would be chosen. That's his claim. Now, notice, like I said, I don't know if you caught it, notice what he did there. His claim is completely unjustified. In order to show why fine-tuning argument isn't true, he made a claim about the likeliness of creating possible universes. Now, here's the problem. So remember what we said in, I think it was the empirical evidence fallacy video. You cannot make a claim about evidence unless something is not defined, unless something is sufficiently well defined. Now, he made a claim about the nature of God. He made a claim about the evidence that we see here based on how he defined God. Now, here's the problem. He engaged in stars and stripes fallacy. So basically, he placed a condition on God, which said that he's more likely, right, to create some other universes, or he would be more likely to create, if he's a creator, as a creator, he's more likely to create all other types of universes and less likely to create this particular one or one specific one. Why? What is your justification for the claim that God is more or less likely to do anything? How do you know he's not less likely to make a whole bunch of universes? How do you know he's not more likely to create just this one and less likely to create any others? You don't know that. How would you know? Again, if we make the claim that God is the creator of the universe, which is actually what he alluded to, or God is any being with the property that they created the universe, what justifies your claim that he's more or less likely to do anything? Right? You don't know. You would have to know more about creating universes to at least make a reasonable inference on what other properties such a being would have. Right? Like I said before, if you make a claim that there exists a such thing as a wizard, right? Then and that wizard is, if that wizard is human, you know enough about being human that you can make an inference about other properties that person would have if they're a wizard. In other words, they would at least need to eat, right? If they're human, because as far as we know, all life forms have to eat or consume energy, specifically humans, right? And I could go on and on. They need to breathe air, so on and so forth. I don't know enough about creating universes to say one way or other what they're more or less likely to do. And this is what I'm talking about, right? So he countered the argument with an argument about God, or a claim about God, where he just made up his own random condition on God, he just made up in his head. No, right? And this is what the atheist will always do. It's always some version of that. Now, of course, if you ask him, he'll say, well, no, I'm not necessarily making a claim or placing some condition on God. I'm just reasonably going all the way back to the beginning. So I'm saying, if we look at all the possibilities, let's say God had no bias at all, then it is reasonable to presume, is it reasonable to presume, if we say at least that he's a creator, then with just that definition alone, it is reasonable to say that initially there would have been a possibility of all types of universes, right? And we don't know why this particular one was created, but if we just add that sort of definition that he's creator, then virtually anything is possible, right? How can we know? But this is the problem, right? And I alluded to what I'm about to say in one of the previous videos, I forget which one, but I didn't say it explicitly. So what the atheist is not acknowledging, and I believe this is a rational claim, what he's not acknowledging is that you also can't make the claim that there was nothing in the beginning or God could have been anything. That's also not really true or not really justified, right? He's going to the sort of infinite potential position, where if we accept that God exists, right, if we're talking about literally the first cause in the beginning of the universe, so there was no bias toward anything, in theory, anything could have been possible. But we know from our observational reality that that's not true. That's not how the beginning of the universe started. In other words, there was always some bias eternally. I call it the eternal bias. In other words, there was always some bias that always existed in reality, whether you want to call it God or not. There was always a bias towards something. Now, how could that be? How could there have just been a bias towards something when there was nothing? That's the nature of reality. I don't know what to tell you. The fact that we're here shows there was a bias. So, for example, even if you don't believe in God, right? Why couldn't the universe just have stayed as nothingness forever? You know what I mean? Existing outside of time or before time, right? Well, if the atheist probably believes there always was time. But let's say that there always was time. Why are we here? How did the universe go from nothingness to somethingness that made us possible, right? Or if you believe in God, right? What caused God to at one point exist outside of time and then create time and at some point create us? What allowed that? Why couldn't he just stay in timeless space forever? Or if there was no God, well, it seems silly to say that, but let's take an atheist belief. Let's say there was no God, right? Why couldn't the physical universe just exist as nothingness? Or why couldn't it just be jello forever, right? That's all there is across all of time and space is jello, right? Why is anything here, right? My argument is that you can only really explain the existence of us by virtue of the fact that there must have always been a bias in reality, something that was pressuring it to be a particular thing and not something else, right? Again, that's hard. It's hard for us to say, well, how could that have been? The fact that we're here would seem to say it was, right? I don't know what else to tell you. And there are many things in reality that go against our natural intuition, right? So wave particle duality at the quantum level, that counters our intuition about the nature of reality, right? Special relativity. Multiple people can measure the same object and all get different energy values. How could this one object have different, moving, how could it have different quantities of kinetic energy? How could it have different kinetic energies at the same exact time for its total kinetic energy? That's what special relativity tells us, at least for its non-relativistic kinetic energy. That's what it tells us. Who knows why? 0-point energy. Particles just pop up out of nowhere in empty space. How is that possible? Many things go against our intuition, right? And the thing that would generally go against our intuition is that there was always a bias in reality. Like I said, I call it the eternal bias. I alluded to it in one of the previous videos, but I didn't explicitly mention it. So if you have the concept of eternal bias, then you can't make a claim about this universe was more likely or that universe was more likely, because there was always some type of bias. Something was always unlikely. And we even can make the claim that that us not existing was less likely by virtue of the fact that we're here. Now you can make an argument, well, not necessarily, even if you argue, you can't make a claim that it was less likely, which is actually be true. You can't make a claim that it was less likely by virtue of the fact that we're here, because even if something's less likely, it's still possible. But you could make the claim that there wasn't a bias that made it impossible for us to exist, right? There was some bias that made it possible. That's a bias too, right? So there was always some eternal bias that always existed for all of time and will always exist forever, right? And it just goes back to what I said before. You can't make a claim about evidence of God without it being, well, God being well defined enough. And if you make some extraneous definition of God, like, okay, I have made the definition that he's less likely to create these universes versus these, then why is that a necessary condition for God to exist? That's just one you made up in your head, right? And if you argue that, well, God can exist without that necessary definition, let's take it off, go to the bare bones necessary definition, which is he created the universe. Now tell me why he's more likely to create this universe over another, right? And then you can't do it, which goes back to what I said. And so this is what I'm talking about. You can see that what he did is exactly what I told you guys. Made up some random claim about the he made up some random claim about the condition of God, right? And then made a logical claim based on some claim he just made up in his head, right? Stars and stripes fallacy. He pretended as if the condition he just randomly made up was somehow, that reality had to somehow operate according to what he randomly made up in his head. I can also make up a random definition in my head. None of these arguments are scientific. They're just sort of random claims. And that's what I really wanted to point to, right? But no, and you will notice how he surreptitiously included it in the argument in such a way that made it seem more rational. This is what atheists always do. They always will include some fallacy very subtly, right? So it seems like what they're saying makes more sense, or it's more logical. I mean, I could see through it since I've been a kid, right? So I'm kind of used to it, but he surreptitiously included it, but it was completely not justified, right? But if you didn't catch it, you might go along with the sort of just random thing he made up out of nowhere. And then he made another argument. Let me see the second one. Go back here. So the second point he made was that fine-tuning only implies there might be something correlating to I think he meant constraints, or the constants of the standard model. Which that doesn't make, I don't know why he keeps saying that, right? It's the Goldilocks nature of reality that allowed life goes way beyond just the standard model, right? We're talking about our particular galaxy or solar system. Life doesn't exist, as far as we know. We've covered so much distance, right? Using a telescope looking at the universe, and we've never seen life. It has nothing to do with just the existence of a standard model of particle physics. I don't know why I keep saying that. But anyway, he says the fine-tuning only implies that there might be something correlating to constants. That's it. That something could just be some more fundamental physics, right? Or in other words, I guess he's saying if we learn more about physics, then we can explain the existence of life. Then he says, could be more fundamental physics, it could be God, or it could be something else. The fine-tuning argument is not an argument for God. It is an argument to see if constants are correlated. Which, and that's basically what I want to get at with this whole point here. Now notice what he's doing. He's deconstructing the argument, or all he's doing and everything he just said is showing that the argument of fine-tuning doesn't prove God. But notice what he did. What he's really doing is appeal. Now it's subtle, right? But nothing can prove anything. I can't prove I'm standing here speaking to you, right? For all you know, you could be in the Matrix, right? And I could be a figment of your imagination. Notice what he's doing. What he's doing is appealing to the absolute standard of knowing. And this is what I said. Atheists always play fast and loose, right? Notice how subtle it was. But, like I said, when I debate atheists, I already know all of these principles. So I just kind of can pick it apart and I can just say, okay, he did this fallacy here, this fallacy there, that fallacy there. So I'm used to it. But when I saw that, I was like, let me make a video about it, right? Because you notice how subtly he did it, right? And if you're not used to it, you might think, oh, well, what he said was fairly rational, this and that. No, it wasn't, right? As far as I know, practically every atheist argument isn't. So what was the problem with what he said? Well, he's deconstructing his argument by saying, well, it could have been this, it could have been that, it could have been this, who knows, right? I can make that argument about anything, which is what I said. I think it was the subjectivity fallacy video, right? I can make anything not exist by just making my definition of evidence stringent enough. It's easy, right? The same way what he's doing is increasing the standard of what proof is. And you can always just increase it enough to make it so that something can't possibly meet it. And the reason you can do that is because there's nothing we can absolutely know for sure. And you can really say the reason he could do this is just by definition of what evidence is. So like I said, at least the way we define evidence is any piece of information that once you perceive it, right? Once you perceive this piece of information, it increases your conviction that some belief is true, or some proposition or some statement is true. That's it, right? When you see enough evidence, your conviction might be so high that you just say, okay, I now believe this is true. That's it. It's just an opinion it's your opinion about something. It's not an absolute statement about reality, nor is it science. It is your opinion that's virtually no different than saying your opinion about what the best color is, right? But what he's doing is he's appealing, when he keeps saying that it could be this, it could be that, this doesn't prove this, he's appealing to the absolute standard of evidence, which is a standard of evidence which says when you see it, you can't possibly not have your conviction increase. It must increase whether you like it or not, right? In other words, as far as I can tell, it would have to take your free will away from you, right? Because as long as I have free will, it doesn't matter how good we would consider some evidence to be. I have the freedom to deny its existence or choose to believe that this piece of information does not increase my conviction. It does not mean that this statement how do I want to word it? If I see a piece of information, it doesn't mean that this statement is probably true, right? It's very difficult for me to spit that out. But it just meaning that it doesn't increase my conviction that this statement is true, right? If I see this piece of information, I absolutely have to have a more increased conviction. But I would argue if that's true, then my free will must be taken away in order to do that, because now I can't just choose to not believe in something, right? I can have many reasons for choosing not to believe something. There could be many different aspects of my belief system that allows that and allows me to look at some piece of information and say, no, my conviction is not increased. So this is not evidence to me, right? There are many reasons I can do that, but it ultimately boils down to free will. If there is some absolute piece of evidence, it necessarily must take away my free will. And if my free will is still intact, then by definition, it's not absolute evidence, right? And then we can also talk about absolute knowing, right? There's nothing I can know absolutely, right? Or I say rationally, because I can even doubt my own existence, right? That by definition, I can do that by virtue of free will, but I can't rationally do it, right? So the only thing we can absolutely know rationally is that we exist. Nothing else can we absolutely know rationally. I can't absolutely know the sun will come up tomorrow. I can't absolutely know for sure there's a moon. Some people don't think there is, right? They think there's some firmament on the planet, and that's an illusion or something, right? I can't absolutely know anything rationally except that I exist. That's it, right? So what atheists will often do is appeal to this idea of absolute evidence or absolute knowing. No rational argument no argument of any kind is going to be able to do that. Nothing can meet that standard. No form of science, nothing in our experience, nothing tells us that something is absolutely true. It is an unachievable standard for everything. You know what I mean? Nothing meets that standard, let alone arguments for God. So in other words, what he's saying there, when he says, oh, well, it could be this, it could be that, who knows, right? Technically, he's right, to be fair. But that's kind of why I want to talk about this video, because this argument of fine-tuning is what's called a rationalist argument, right? It is an argument solely based on logic. Math is based on logic, but it's not making a claim. A logical claim doesn't have to describe reality, just like math doesn't have to describe reality just because it's logical, right? You can first of all, let me go back up. We can never know anything absolutely, including the idea that God, well, I feel like I know it. It's a little different for me because there's stuff I'm not saying based on my theory about the nature of subconscious things like that. I feel like we all know God exists absolutely for sure, right? But going by their sort of, well, they know God exists too. They just delude themselves, engage in denialism because it makes them more comfortable. But what I want to say is, let's say you couldn't know God exists absolutely, right? Then your standard for sort of believing he exists wouldn't be a rationalist argument, because that's not a description of reality. It would be a scientific one. That is always the standard you should go to for saying God exists. Because if you make a rationalist argument to say this proves God, then by definition you're saying it can't be doubted. But anything can be doubted because you have free will. If you say something proves God, you're also saying it meets the standard of absolute evidence. No one can look at it and not be convicted in their belief that God exists. But nothing meets that standard. Again, your free will have to be taken away from you if such a standard exists. So by definition, nothing can prove God according to the absolute standard, which means any argument you can look at, not only can you just look at it and just choose not to believe it exists, there's going to be some error. There's going to be some unwarranted claim in the rationalist argument, which is correct, right? And then the atheist would look for the unwarranted claim and then attack it and pick your argument apart. And that's what they always do. They're right in the sense that there's always an unwarranted claim, but evidence is right. When we talk about evidence, we say something increases your conviction that something's true relative to a particular standard, right? So nothing meets the absolute standard of evidence, right? But we can give enough evidence where most people might look at it and say, well, you know what, I'm convinced, right? What the atheist always does is they make it sound as if you have to reach the absolute standard of evidence before it becomes rational to believe in God. That doesn't make any sense. Nothing meets the absolute standard of evidence. I wouldn't believe in anything if I was simply holding out for something to meet the absolute standard of evidence. I wouldn't believe in anything. Nothing would exist to me except for myself. That doesn't make any sense. It's nonsense, right? What you would have to do if you're kind of holding on to that kind of silly standard before you're willing to believe in something, right, is if you hold on to that standard, right? Now, of course, they don't hold on to standard for anything. They only specifically hold on to it for God because they're, you know why at this point, right? I've said it so many times. But they specifically hold on to it for God. And then what they'll try to do is make it seem, which you saw in what that guy was saying, they'll make it seem like the more rational thing to do is to not believe in God by virtue of their appeal to the absolute standard, right? And that's what atheism fundamentally is. Basically, I like to think of atheism as a marketing gimmick, right? It's a marketing gimmick because what they do, right, is you can take any argument or any piece of data or anything about God that suggests God exists. They're going to immediately appeal to the absolute standard of evidence, which nothing can meet, right? No one can absolutely know anything. There's no such thing as absolute evidence of anything. But they'll appeal to that. And now they'll always be able to reach it because nothing can reach it. They'll always have the ability to show why something isn't true based on that standard, or why something doesn't prove a claim based on that standard, because nothing can prove a claim based on that standard. So it's always available to them. They always got that, right? But what they'll do is they'll try to word things in such a way, and like I said before, flowery language, and try to make it look like they're being more rational. No, all they're doing is increasing the standard of evidence to some completely unreachable standard, and no one would believe in anything if they reached that standard. But they don't say that out front. They market their ideas as if they're doing something more intellectual or more scientific, and this and that. And like I said, I never was really convinced by that. I could always see through that since I was a kid. But reading this here, I argue that they'll always do that in really three main ways. But to read this off, it says, the guiding principle underlying almost every atheist argument, and I say almost because maybe there are ones I haven't seen, but almost every atheist argument is grounded in denialism. In other words, it's just a form of denial. They don't prove anything. There's no gaining more information. They don't seek more information. Nothing. All it is this isn't true for some possible reason. Right? And that's why God doesn't exist, basically. So it's grounded in denialism, and they always make an appeal to three things: the absolute standard of evidence, stars and stripe fallacy, and what I call escape plan fallacy. So that's one that I kind of think of in my head. I didn't say it in the videos, but I figured I'll just say it here. I just call it escape plan fallacy. So what are these? What does this mean? What I'm saying there is that no matter what argument you hear from an atheist, right, and no matter what the argument is, from the beginning of time till the end of time, every atheist argument, I believe, will follow these three principles. It'll look like some framework that's doing some complex stuff and there's a whole bunch going on with the argument. No. Underlying all these sort of superficial sort of fanciness that they're trying to do in the intellectualness of their argument, underlying it is the bone of the argument. The framework of the argument is just denialism based on these three principles. That's it. So the three principles are, like I already said it, appeal to the absolute standard of evidence. So any argument an atheist gives, they're going to say why God doesn't exist. So I'm talking about atheists who would assert there is no God. So that's generally what I'm talking about. They're going to, in saying why God doesn't exist or why some argument isn't true, why some argument doesn't prove God's existence, they're going to appeal to absolute evidence. Nothing can meet absolute standard of evidence, so they'll always have that available to them. They don't apply that standard for anything else they believe in life. They believe in many things based on not having an absolute standard of evidence. By the way, I should mention, if nothing has an absolute standard of evidence, that also means that you're always going to accept something on some degree of faith as well, right? If I see a guy, if I'm flashing money in a dark alley, and I see a guy coming toward me with like this, and I hear a gun clicked, or whatever, right? I'm not going to assume he's coming to say hi to me. Do I know for sure? No. But I'm acting on some modicum of faith. And by the way, you do the same thing in science. Like I said, no one's ever seen a virtual particle before. Like I said, no matter how much, and then scientists might say, no, we created it in the lab. We created it in particle colliders and this and that. We see the tracks, and the sometimes it's like bubble or water or whatever. We see the tracks in some material which shows us it shows us that this particle exists. We understand its properties, this and that. Fine. You still have never seen a particle, right? A virtual particle acting on mediating particles, let's say strong force. You've never been able to observe it. You're acting on faith that it's there. It doesn't matter how accurate quantum field theory is, doesn't matter how many experiments you perform to verify the accuracy of quantum field theory, makes no difference, right? You've never seen a virtual particle. By definition, you're hoping that all of this data demonstrates that this thing is here. So you're acting on faith. Might be a little tiny bit of faith, but it's still faith, right? And that's another sort of thing that atheists try to pretend doesn't happen. Everybody acts on faith for everything they believe in because nothing meets the absolute standard of evidence. You could argue except for the fact that you exist, right? So different people have different standards of faith that they're willing to accept before they believe something, right? And so when the atheist requires this absolute standard of evidence, right, first of all, they may have a standard of faith that they want a sufficiently low standard of faith before they're willing to believe in something. That's just an opinion. Everyone has different ones, has nothing to do with actual evidence or just being a description of that reality or being more rational or more logical, right? It's just literally just your opinion. And I'll get to what the more rational and logical thing is in a moment. So yeah, they'll always make an appeal to absolute standard of evidence. Like I said, they don't follow that for anything else, but for God, they'll just always appeal to it because they always got it in their back pocket because nothing can meet it. The other things in stars and stripes fallacy, they always place some random condition on God or some random condition on reality they just made up in their head, and then they'll make a logical assessment as if the condition they just made up is a true statement about reality. No, reality doesn't have to match this random thing you just said in your head. Why? Right? They never justify that. But like I said, the word their arguments sophisticated enough and surreptitiously enough that it doesn't seem like that's what they're doing. But they'll always do it. And like I said, you just saw it for the guy who made a claim about what God's more or less likely to do. How do you know that? You just made that claim up. You don't know what he's more or less likely to. For all you know, there's only one likely possibility, that's to create this universe. You don't know, right? If you make the claim that, well, I'm assuming that there was no bias at all in the universe, even that's not a claim you can make. There was always an eternal bias that was there. Right? You don't know what the scope of that eternal bias was. You just can't know, right? So they'll always fit that in. And then escape plan fallacy is one I didn't really talk about. I alluded to it in a video with subjectivity fallacy. So escape plan fallacy is basically if there's only phenomena that we can verify subjectively. So there's an objectively true phenomenon in reality, but it's only subjectively verifiable. It means that it's always going to be mixed in with personal opinion, right? This is why scientists generally hate. This is why scientists generally hate subjectively verifiable phenomena, because it's mixed in with personal opinion. You can't get it by itself. Wherever in nature it shows up, it's always going to show up with personal opinion sort of surrounding it. So you just have to do your best to sift through personal opinion to try to get that absolute truth. Objective truth isn't like that. Objectively verifiable truth isn't like that, which are the laws of physics. So for example, the idea that if you poke a person, they'll feel pain. That's a subjectively verifiable phenomena. You could take all the measurements of the body and biological data you feel like, right? But you're never going to know how much pain that person is actually in based on what you did, because it's subjectively verifiable. Like I said before, this is an issue with painkillers, right? People who are addicted to painkillers will just say, oh, I'm in pain, right? The doctor could do however many measurements they feel like, but they can't be sure, right? Because they have enough data to conclude this person is most likely in pain, but they just can't know how much pain they're in. It's hidden. It's mixed in with opinion. All right, so they have to just ask them because their opinion can't be verified objectively, in an objectively verifiable way, right? So that's how all of science is. That's all of medical sciences and neuroscience, and it's very difficult to study these things. In other words, these things are difficult to obtain as much truth for as physics because they're mixed in with opinion and personal proclivities and things like that, right? So that's annoying. That's very annoying for a scientist. But here's the thing, reality doesn't care how annoying you think it is to get its information, right? It's going to operate the way it does, whether you like it or not, right? So you just have to do your best to work around it to get that information. But escape plan fallacy is if we're studying something that's objectively true about reality, but is only subjectively verifiable, then if I make a prediction about what should happen or this or that, or something, if I make a prediction and what ends up being true failed, it shows that my prediction failed basically, so I deviate from what I predicted would happen. I always have the option of just appealing to, oh, it was just this person's opinion or his personal whatever, right? Personal belief, or he was hallucinating. I can always demonstrate that it is the subjective part of the sort of phenomenon. Because like I said, the truth and the subjectivity always come in pairs for subjectively verifiable phenomena. So in other words, there's some opinion-based part that just purely represents whatever this person was feeling. It's not an objective truth of reality. Because the objective truth of reality, if it's subjectively verifiable, always comes paired with that opinion part. I can always appeal to the opinion part for when my prediction fails. That's always available to me for a subjectively verifiable phenomena. For example, if I say a chick will always fall in love with me if I say some smooth line to her, right? I go up to a chick, say some smooth line, and then when my prediction fails and she doesn't fall in love with me, I can say there was something specifically about her that caused it to fail. It is still an objective truth to some degree in reality. I could have set that up a little better, but I think you get what I'm trying to say, right? I can always appeal to there was something about her that changed it, or something about her that messed it up, right? Whereas if she didn't have that sort of mess up in her biology or that mess up in her brain, something, then my theory would have been correct. I can always do that. I can do it a million times and still say the same thing, right? Because you can't objectively prove I'm wrong, because what I said can only be verified subjectively, right? Or it is only subjectively verifiable. So in other words, I have an escape plan for when my prediction fails, right? So you can always do that if you make a prediction about an objective truth about reality, but it's only subjectively verifiable. You always have that escape plan when your prediction fails. It was always something having to do with the person or their brain or their personality or something that prevented it from, that was the reason my plan failed, but the objective truth is still there, right? Or I could say the lack of, in this case, more accurate to say the lack of objective truth. If I say something's objectively not true, which would have been a better way to describe it. If I say there's something objectively not true about reality, and someone says there is an objective truth in reality, if their objective truth, if they make a prediction and that objective truth appears to be correct, I can just say, no. That was the person's imagination. That was the subjective part of their own personality or imagination or whatever. It made it seem like it was correct in that instance, but it really wasn't. It was just them. I always got that escape plan for when my prediction fails and some other prediction succeeds. And so ultimately, my argument is that every atheist argument fundamentally underlying all these sort of, like I said, sophisticated talk and flowery language and, the surreptitious sort of maneuvering that they do, underlying all of it is just these three principles. The whole system of atheism is based on these principles, right? Now, because atheists never make any predictions, they don't have a theory about reality that makes predictions. Well, they technically do, but it fails all the time. It never succeeds. Specifically, the part that deviates from the dualist model, it always fails. So that's why this guy is so important, the escape plan. They always have used the escape plan fallacy, because they never gain more information about reality, because their predictions always fail. They fail every time, right? So like I said, it's always these three. So let's take some examples. So near-death experiences, that's a good one. Many people look at a near-death experience and say, actually no, before I get into it, I was going to say the proper standard of evidence for God, which I mentioned before, is the same standard as for science, right? You don't want any opinion-based standard, so you're just picking an opinion of what you think is convincingly true. That's just an opinion. All types of people have their opinion. In some people's opinion, geological data doesn't prove the Earth is round, right? It proves the Earth is flat. It's just your opinion, right? It doesn't mean anything, right? For people back in the day, in their opinion, the evidence shown that we are at the center of the universe, right? It means nothing, right? It's literally just an opinion. Science is an epistemological standard that is very rigorous and very well structured and organized. It's very hard to say something's true or false relative to that particular standard. That's why we pick it, right? Now, you can say when you say God exists, or even, I don't like to use the term proving, but when you say that there's evidence of God, or you strongly believe in God based on this evidence, you're talking about relatively scientific standard. Now, atheists can never do that, because they don't make any predictions. Their predictions always fail. So they never say there isn't a God according to a scientific standard. Well, they do try, but then they just they go exactly what I'm saying here, into this sort of flowery nonsense, but underlying it, they're just doing this, right? They can never make a claim that's a scientific claim that God doesn't exist or likely doesn't exist in a relatively standard of science. It's impossible. Their theories always fail. It would be like me saying scientifically there's no such thing as atoms. It's impossible, right? But, so yeah, now the dualist model is completely different. We can say most likely God exists based on the science, right? So, you shouldn't do it according to a rational standard, is basically what I want to establish. In other words, you don't want to say, well, I can prove God exists from some sufficiently airtight argument. No. You say, I believe God exists, or he most likely exists, based on the available evidence. Now, based on the science and the available evidence. Now, is that absolute proof? No. But then nothing's absolute proof. There's no absolute proof that atoms exist. There's no absolute proof we're in the Milky Way galaxy. There's no absolute proof I'm standing here, right? But if we're just doing on the basis of science, which is true for everything else we believe in the laws of physics because they satisfy the conditions of science. Until something shows us otherwise, we believe we're justified in this belief. Same thing with God. We have a theory about God that fits the epistemological standard of science. We believe God exists based on the science. If something else comes along and says otherwise, hey, but until then, we're going to believe it based on the science. So that's a lower standard, obviously, than the absolute standard, but that's the standard you're most justified according to, not the rationalist argument standard. So I see some people who believe in God doing that when they debate atheists. No, you wouldn't use a rationalist argument standard. It can always be picked apart. Because if a rationalist argument proves God, then by definition it meets the absolute standard of evidence, and then by definition your free will is taken away from you and you can't look at it and not be more convinced. That's impossible. So that's an impossible standard to convince. Impossible standard to reach. So to go into this, let's look at near-death experiences. So what will atheists say about near-death experiences? Oh, those don't prove God, right? Those aren't a supernatural event, right? Well, why? They certainly seem supernatural. They follow all the properties we would expect of a supernatural phenomenon, right? Their sensory experience is extremely intense, far more intense than what we know of in the waking world and what we've ever experienced in our life. They give us information which seems to go far outside of our own knowledge and even our imagination. Sometimes the positivity experience or the negativity experience is far beyond what we've ever experienced our entire life. People's minds expand during experiences far beyond what they ever had in life, far beyond what seems possible for the human brain. And we could go on and on, right? Even the having experience itself when the brain is near death doesn't seem possible. Why would the brain why would the brain provide a more organized experience, intensely much more organized experience when it physically is becoming far more disorganized? It doesn't make any sense. It would seem, like I said before, to violate the second law of thermodynamics related to entropy. And we could go on and on, right? But what's an atheist going to say to these arguments? Well, for one, they're going to say this doesn't prove God. So in that case, that they're just going to appeal to the absolute standard of evidence. Well, nothing proves anything, right? But they're not going to word it that way. In that moment, they're going to appeal to the absolute standard of evidence. Well, none of these really prove God. You don't really know for sure. We can't know anything for sure based on anything. So it's a meaningless statement. It's just a cop-out. But then what they'll say is, if near-death experience were of God, and Jesus, let's say Jesus which is the actual truth, but let's say you believe Jesus Christ is King of Kings. Well, why are there near-death experiences that don't have Jesus in it? Or why did they have Muhammad or Buddha, right? That's proof your claim is incorrect. No, that's Stars and Stripes fallacy. Why is that the case? You just placed some random condition on reality and said that if Jesus exists, every religious affirming near-death experience must have him, or Jesus can't exist by definition. So in other words, if Jesus exists and he's the Son of God, which he is, then he must have the necessary condition attached to him in order to exist. He must also have that necessary condition that he will show up in every religious affirming near-death experience reported. Why? Why can't he exist without that condition? And then they'll say, why would he? Exactly. That's a different question of why would he this and that. And by the way, that's answered in near-death experiences too, right? We're going to talk more about the potential answer to that later in chapter 10, because I practice actual science. But the asking you why this and that is not the same as saying it can't exist without this random nonsense condition you made up in your head, right? You can actually question of like I said before, why do particles have charge, right? It's very obvious that the stability of matter depends on charges, right? And strong force, but depends on charges, right? So the macroscopic world is very important to have electromagnetic charge. Microscopic one too, but I'm just saying we notice it more. Our experience of reality in a more macroscopic scale is mostly, it has a very unique experience based on electromagnetic energy. But I'm just saying, where do charges come from? Why do quarks have charges? Why do electrons have charges? Who made that? Who made that? Where's that coming from? Why is it sustained? No, we don't know the answer to that. Can I just now say that, oh, well, if you don't have this particular answer, then this thing can't exist? Of course not, right? When I say I know something, it's not relative to knowing everything about it. It's relative to available evidence. The science shows charged particles exist. We don't know why they have charge, right? We just know that they do. When I say I know something, it's relative to the evidence. The evidence says that they're charged particles. I'm not saying I know something relative to the absolute standard of knowing, meaning I have to know everything or I can't know it at all. Nonsense. That's what atheists do, right? In other words, if I said, if atoms existed, right, then there would be, let's just say I make up some random claim about why they would have charge, right? And I say they can't exist until you can prove my claim. Or I would say that charges would, well, I'm kind of making a bad example. But I think you get what I'm saying. I was going to go somewhere else with, but I'm like, no, I think I'm mixing up two different things. But suffice it to say, right, we don't know why particles have charge. We just know that they do, and we accept it because we can still know they exist according to the standard of science, the epistemological standard of science. Now, what the atheist is doing there, and she says, oh, well, why would this and that? Again, you can believe something exists according to the standard of science without necessarily knowing the why, right? All the evidence will point in a particular direction. And there are many people who have studied this, looked at all the near-death experiences and spiritual experiences, and it's all over the place that Jesus Christ is King of Kings. The evidence just about proves it, right? Like not according to the absolute standard of evidence, right, or knowing, but the scientific standard pretty much proves Jesus Christ is King. Like I said, you can look up, I remember I was searching for something even online, right? This like AI generator even just said it, like the amount of experiences people have with Jesus in all religions, not just Christianity, all of them, right? Compare it to any other religious figure, right? Now, many near-death experiences don't have a religious figure, but of the ones that do, Jesus shows up in exponentially more. It's not like a little bit more. It's way more. It's not even a little tiny bit close, and he's the only one who has a regular pattern of appearance of people who aren't even Christian. That's not true at all for any other religious figure. And then there are other ways you can show the truth of Jesus Christ. It's all over the place. You know why? Because it's true, right? If something's true, it's going to show up over and over and over again in different facets of reality, right? But what the atheist says is, if Vishnu shows up in a Hindu's experience, by definition, Jesus is not God or God doesn't exist. Why? Why is that necessary condition? Why does Jesus have to have this necessary condition in order to exist? And they never can explain it because they just made it up in their head. I can do the same thing with many things in physics. But before I go further, what they're doing is taking something they believe at the level of intuition. It makes sense to them that if Jesus was the Son of God and he wants us to all believe in him for our salvation, so our sins can be washed away, then he would show up in near-death. He would show up in all near-death experiences because that would be the best chance of getting that, right? Science shows that reality doesn't always meet what you intuitively know, right? And then evil deity fallacy, if Jesus exists, he has a reason for doing things that's beyond our understanding. We're the baby in the equation with the doctor poking us with the needle. The baby couldn't just say, don't poke me with a needle. I know everything and you're wrong. That wouldn't make any sense. That's what the atheist does with God. That's what the atheist does when they place the random made-up conditions in their head on God. They know this is the best way of doing something. Their understanding says that this is the smartest thing to do. So if God doesn't do it, and he's smart, presumably he's smart too. If I'm not smarter, right? That's what the atheist would say. Then he should be doing this. So by definition, if he's not doing it, then I can conclude he doesn't exist. Now, it's not just that my claim or my understanding may be flawed, because the presumption was that I'm smart. My claim isn't flawed because I'm smart enough to make these claims about the creator of the universe. That doesn't make any sense. So it's just another example of the flaws in atheist logic. So then the last escape plan fallacy, so like we said, now, if the atheists claim that these are just delusions in people's heads and this and that, right? I should back up for a moment. They'll say that these experiences, even though they have all these conditions, right, of sensory experience and things like that, they'll say, no, it's an illusion or it's a delusion. escape plan fallacy. They're appealing to the fact because these are subjectively verifiable phenomena, they always have the out where they can just say it's the subjectivity of the experience that created. There's no objective truth that is being observed in these experiences. No objective truth that is coming out in these experiences, right? They'll just say it's purely a person's subjective whatever. So it's just they imagined it and they hallucinated and they had a mental illness, or they're faking it, or they're lying, and it's always some escape plan, right? It's always something that they just imagined or something, right? And I can do that with any subjectively verifiable phenomena, right? If I had you right here and I said, perform a calculation of 1,000,000 times 1,000,000. Let's say a person actually did it, right? I could say, no, you cheated, and I can't prove you didn't cheat. You could say, like, I didn't have anything. No, you cheated somehow or something, because I can't really prove it, right? I can always appeal. I can always make an appeal to something that happened in your mind, or you didn't really do this, or no, you did it beforehand and you just remembered these steps. You didn't really, or someone told you what I was going to say before. I can always use, there's nothing you could do to prove me wrong, right? Escape plan fallacy. So in other words, every atheist argument is you can either say it's one of them or a mix of them or all of them at once. Every argument is always going to be this. And what I argue is it's never going to be a prediction that deviates from the dualist model. So for example, they'll say, these are hallucinations. Okay, so if they're hallucinations according to your theory, right, then for one, there should be, since this is based purely on the person's brain and biology, there should be biological factors we can use to make predictions, right? Because that's science. Science is about having a theory and making predictions. We should be able to predict near-death experiences. We should be able to recreate them. I know there's some, like I said, there's this piloting program when they have people in a centrifuge and they say they could reproduce them. Not true, right? At least I've seen it. I've seen flaws in it already. It completely wasn't true. But I need to read the whole report, which I just haven't done that yet. I haven't seen anything that can fully reproduce near-death experiences. The predictions they make about near-death experiences. So it's like I was saying, there should be biological factors you can use to say, okay, more than likely on this condition, you're going to see this, or you're going to see this. There's no biological factors. There's nothing they can really use to determine who's going to have a near-death experience. They've been happening since the beginning of time, has nothing to do with culture or what you grew up to believe or this or that. Some degree of the experience, yes, is based on belief. We're going to talk about the metaphysics of that in chapter 10. There are many aspects of experience that aren't at all. Like I said, Jesus appears to everybody, whether you believe him or not, right? He appears to children. Everybody sees Jesus Christ, or every demographic group. There are multiple aspects of near-death experiences which are not normal for a person's experience. They don't follow these same parameters or these same behaviors as mental illnesses. In these experiences, when people say they meet God, never are they told to do something evil or live it up. You only live once, do sex, drugs, alcohol, this and that. Happens all the time with mental illnesses. And so we could go on, right? There are parameters, consistencies to these experiences that do not line up with what we would expect if it were just of the mind. Right? Why do people have these? When people have these experiences? Why doesn't God just say random incoherent stuff like chicken, grass, sky, and then the person woke up? Right? We do see stuff like that in our dreams. We see stuff like that in mental illnesses. That should at least with a fairly regular pattern of reporting happen in near-death experiences because a person's actually near death. And not to mention, I don't know if I mentioned before, what's the evolutionary or natural selection-based reason for near-death experiences? Do people who are near death and have these experiences have increased survival rates? Did that happen enough times that natural selection caused this sort of function in the brain to develop? Nonsense, right? So their theories about near-death experiences, they never line up with what we actually observe. None of the theories about God or supernatural line up. So because they never do, they'll always have escape plan fallacy and they don't make predictions, right? So, all these experiences, despite them being the same since the beginning of time, despite people always having them, and saying the same things, God saying the same things over and over again, they'll always say, you hallucinated it, you imagined it, and it was in your head, and it was just a dream, and this and that, right? And Now, how do you explain the aspects of the experience that deviate from your prediction? Then you go back to faith, right, or absolute evidence. Well, that doesn't necessarily prove that, that this is of God. We don't really know what happened, right? One day science will figure it out. So now you went back to absolute evidence requirement, right? We can't know anything according to the absolute standard of evidence or absolute knowing. So you can see that it's just a cycle. No matter what I give you, no matter what I say, you can always appeal to these three, right, arguments. And this is fundamentally the framework of all atheist logic, right? And when you say there's evidence, person has evidence of God, oh, show me evidence, and oh, that doesn't count as evidence, and this and that. Sometimes they'll engage in subjectivity fallacy. I want 100% empirical evidence. Like when they say, some people will say near-death experiences only occur a very small amount of times. Oh, well, why isn't that the case? Why doesn't it happen more often? Placing a condition on reality. So my camera cut off. So where I think I left off was talking about near-death experiences, right? So when an atheist says, oh, why do near-death experiences only happen a short amount of times? Out of all the times a person's close to death, it should happen more, right? Once again, placing a condition on reality. Why? Why does that have to happen? Or they'll say it should happen under controlled conditions. Why does God have to give these people experience under a controlled condition in order for it to be true? You know what I mean? That's just some random claim you made up. Plus, not to mention, even if people don't have a near-death experience, many people have spiritual experiences. Virtually everyone has had them, right? People just pretend like they don't. Even atheists will let you know that they have had a spiritual experience of some kind, something that doesn't make sense according to the normal sort of everyday experience. What will the atheists say? Oh, well, it was just in their head, and who knows what really happened. And you can see, no matter what the claim is, I can always appeal to one of these three sort of properties or frameworks, prospects. I don't know if that's the right word. But I can appeal to one of these three sort of principles underlying the entire framework of atheism. Right, and that's basically what I want to establish in this video. It doesn't matter what argument, right? No matter what argument I give you, right? You can always use either one of these principles or a mix of them to sort of show why what I said it's not reasonable to believe in God based on these. And like I said, these are fallacies. Now, atheists will never use these standards for anything that they accept as true, right? Everything you accept on faith in reality, there's no such thing as absolute evidence. You accept the laws of physics on faith. You accept your job is going to be there tomorrow on faith, on some degree of faith. Maybe not a lot, but maybe what you would not call a lot, but you still accept it on faith. For God, they need it to be perfect, right? It has to meet the absolute standard of evidence. There can't be any faith, otherwise God can't exist, right? And then questions about God himself. Oh, well, why would God allow all this suffering? And why would God create Satan if he knew he was going to, this and that? First of all, there's two things there. So one, both of them are really stars and stripes fallacy. You're placing a condition on God. You're saying if God exists, then he wouldn't have created Satan who he knew was going to do all this and that. And if God exists, he wouldn't have allowed people to suffer, because he could have just prevented it, especially if he's a good God. A good God wouldn't have allowed that. Once again, placing a condition on reality. How do you know what God, with his eternal bias, because God does have the eternal bias, how do you know that it's not actually a good thing to allow Satan to exist, to express his free will? How do you know it's not a good thing to allow suffering to exist, right? You may not see how it's a good thing, but there's many things in the physical reality that I don't see how these things exist yet. They still happen. Right? Many things happen that are against my intuition, what I think should occur. It's counterintuitive. Virtual particles popping up out of nowhere at 0-point energy range with quantum fluctuations, right? That would seem to violate everything I know about reality, or every intuitive sort of instinct I have about how reality operates is completely violated. Happens anyway, right? Same thing can happen with God, right? You don't know because your mind is smaller. That's not an opinion, right? That is the truth. If you presume God exists, he knows more than you, and he contains the eternal bias, right? You can't make claims about what he would or wouldn't do. Now you see, when all the evidence and all the data, I believe, points to the nature of God being it must resemble or seems to resemble something close to Christianity, if not everything in the Bible, right? Out of all religions, and to be honest, none of them are even a little bit close to the truth of Jesus, right? All the evidence seems to suggest the truth of Jesus Christ, right? The belief in Jesus isn't based on trying to know everything and have all the answers. Because if that's my standard, why do you believe in physics, right? You don't have all the answers from physics. Why does anything have charge? Tell me that. Why can't anything move past the speed of light? Why is that the limit? You don't know. Then does that mean now it can't exist? Of course not. Your belief isn't based on you sort of justifying everything through a rationalist claim. That would be true. You would have to explain how these things work if it's a rationalist argument. Because when a rationalist argument is justified solely based on how airtight the argument is. An empirical argument or semi-empirical argument is only justified based on the theory itself making predictions that can be verified. That's it. In all the evidence, when you look at it, the theory, when you have a theory and you make predictions about that theory, all of it leads to the truth of Jesus. That's why you believe it. There's still many things I'm not going to know. It is God. I presume my mind is far too small to understand God and all that he does. That's the most logical thing. And atheists will say, oh, you're just saying that because those basically say God have gaps because you can't explain. Not true. There's plenty of things in physical reality I don't understand. Doesn't make it not exist for some reason. If God exists, the same principle would apply. There'll be many things about him I don't understand. Doesn't make it not true. Just some random claim they make up to engage in denialism, right? So in that case, they're appealing to absolute evidence. So like I said, every claim, right, is one of these three. I remember even recently, at least as the time of this recording, there was this thing about how, the smartest guy in the world, apparently, with the highest IQ, says Jesus Christ is king. Because, of course, right? If you're not lazy and you're not sort of just doing what makes you feel more comfortable, what you just want to be true, right? And you just look at the empirical data, you don't need to have all the answers. That's not how truth by empirical data works, right? If you're verifying something by the epistemological standard of science, you don't need to have all the answers. That's not how it works. You only do it based on the ability for a theory to make verifiable predictions. And if there are all these events that you observe in reality that seem to line up with the truth of this theory, especially more so than any other theory, then that's what makes you believe it. And that's exactly what happens with Jesus Christ, right? So yeah, I just wanted to state that, right? One other thing I wanted to mention. I re-recorded some of the videos. I'm going to re-record some other videos. So I forget if I said this in one of my videos or if I took it out, but I'll just say it here. You might hear me say it again later. But there was this one atheist I was debating online, right? So I was telling him how I speak to God, I hear from God. He's told me many things, showed me many things. Of course, he just thinks I'm crazy. And he was saying how, that's just some voice in your head and this and that. And I'm telling him how, no, because I've asked God, right? There was something I wanted so badly, right? Which I talk about it later. I just don't remember if I mentioned this exact story. I do, but I don't know if I re-recorded the video. But anyway, I wanted to watch, I call them adult titles, which I'm going to start talking more about that in the later chapters, right? Because we're going to start talking about that stuff. Excuse me. I call it that because I used to work at a cable company. And we called it adult titles, so I just use that term for adult content. So I wanted so badly to watch that stuff in my relationship with Jesus, and he just kept telling me no, right? No matter how badly I wanted to have a relationship with Jesus and have that at the same time, he kept telling me no. And I wanted it. I wanted to have both. You know what I mean? So I'm telling him, I'm like, if this is just in my head, because he tried to say how, he was saying something that I knew he didn't know what he was talking about. I knew he didn't know what it's like to have a relationship with God based on what he said. But he was saying how, as I told him I speak to God, he's like, notice how everything you say with God, notice how normally it just matches what you coincidentally already believe to be true. Like, that's not true. Like, that's not how it is to have a relationship with Jesus. You get all types of new information all the time, right? there'd be things you think you're doing right, and he'll correct you and say, no, that's not the way, right? And then he'll just give you new information about, okay, do this. He'll just give you new data for something, new information about something you're thinking about. Like, it's completely not what you're saying. It's not just, it's always whatever I thought to be true. Like, this, when people talk, you just know they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what it's like to have a relationship with God and to speak to him. Now, the born again Christians do, because they will talk the exact same way that I talk, and that every people actually have a relationship with God talk a certain way. That's how you know how to discern from the people who do from the people who don't. When you're an atheist, you don't have that because you don't practice any science. You just equate everyone. Everyone who says they speak to God all count for someone who speaks to God. There's no discernment of anything. For them, if someone says, like, it's perfectly possible that, like I said before, some people can say they speak to God, but they don't. It's possible for some people to say they speak to God and actually do, right? How do you know the difference between the two? Well, if you actually practice science, you can understand certain consistencies about the about the experience, and then you can get better at discerning the two, which is exactly what people do in social sciences. When you create a type of psychological profile, let's say a criminal, for example, I think that's the one I used before, you can have certain metrics or certain sort of data points or principles that you recognize, certain consistencies or commonalities that you recognize are pretty common among criminals and people who engage in deviant behavior, right? So when you're in courtroom and you're taking testimony and things like that, and you want to know if someone's credible or if they're telling the truth, you want to have the psychological profile so it's not just based on them saying they did this. Obviously, that's not enough. Right? That's what you do in actual science. Atheists will say, oh, someone said they spoke to God. Okay, everything they said counts for the people who say they spoke to God. No, it's not that simple, right? That's what you do when you don't practice science, which is my claim, right? So anyway, right, I kind of went into that. But anyway, so like I said, I was telling him that, right? And I was telling him how God, that God will tell me many times things I wasn't expecting. And then he changed it, then he changed the standard. He was like, oh, well, that could have just been something deep in your subconscious that you believed. And I'm like, now see, notice what you did there. Notice how now your claim is unfalsifiable. So either it's God tells me something I already believe to be true, and if it's not, then it's just something in my subconscious I didn't know about. Completely unfalsifiable claim. And this is what they always do. In other words, and my point to telling that story is now escape plan fallacy. Now, when his theory didn't measure up, now he didn't say this, but he could have just said, oh, I'm lying and I'm just making it up to be right. Or what he actually said is, there's something in my mind that was the reason why this happened, right? So escape plan. And this is what every atheist argument will always be a mix of these to some degree, right? Now you can make the argument, yeah, but proof in God will be these two. No, it isn't. My argument about why we believe in Jesus Christ, well, why I believe in Jesus Christ and why many people do, right? Some people, yes, may believe it based on this. Some people may believe it based on this. Again, everyone has different standards for what they believe in and how much faith they need before they're willing to say they believe, right? That's just arbitrary. That's just personal to each person. But the moment you start talking about science and rationality and logic, then you're going to the scientific standard. And the scientific standard, 100%, out of all major religions, lends itself to the truth of Jesus Christ, right? Whether you're talking about religions or not, it just lends itself to the truth of Jesus over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. It lends to the truth of Jesus Christ. And many people can see it. It's not hard. It's very easy to analyze all the data and come to that conclusion, right? So I'm believing it based on the scientific standard. Atheists don't do that. They don't have us. They never go according to the scientific standard. They engage in what's generally called like pseudoscience or like fake science. They'll only engage in denialism. Everything, they make no predictions about anything. They don't have any theories about anything that actually makes predictions. They have a whole bunch of theories. Their theories always fail, right? So they just pretty much give up on trying to explain things in terms of some theory. So what they end up doing is they have these types of, these three main principles. These are the underlying principles behind all of their arguments. And what they do, like I said, atheism at its core is just a marketing gimmick. Right? It's a marketing gimmick to use from these three principles, you want to create a kind of system of intellectual language and analysis that, if you aren't able to see through it, it kind of tricks people into thinking that it's saying something logical or it's saying something scientific when actually it isn't, right? And this is why I want to make this video. Because if you have these three, I mean, you have all the fallacies I talked about in the chapter, but keep these three main principles in mind and just hear every atheist argument, every single one, right? And you're going to notice it's always these three, a mix of these three or one of them, right? And you're going to notice every single so-called debunk is just a mix of these, right? It's never based on predictions of any kind, right? Now, if you just make the empirical evidence and empirical predictions, right? Not making claims about what God is, what God isn't. There'll be many things about God you still don't understand. But we're going to talk about what those are later in the videos. We're going to talk about all that stuff. If you do what I talk about in the later videos, I'm talking about the connection between God and the subconscious. I'm going to talk about how to pray to God, right? And receive answers and speak to Him. We're going to talk about negative entities. You're going to see how they respond to statements and ideas about God and spiritual, I was going to say, we're going to talk about that in the next video, how they respond to even the word Jesus Christ and you having a relationship with Jesus, and so on and so forth. All of it, you're going to see all of that and be like, yeah, and you're going to be able to explain other people's behavior when other people have a relation. You see other people talk about their experiences with Jesus, you can pretty much understand it. I'm not going to say perfectly, but it lines up very nicely with the theory that we're going to set up here, right? When I see people talk about Jesus, or they repented and they came to Jesus Christ and they had a spiritual experience, like, makes perfect sense to me. I completely understand. It's exactly what this theory predicts would happen. When people have demonic experiences, you know, they'll be doing certain things, makes perfect sense. It's exactly what this theory predicts will happen. We're going to talk more about in chapter 10, even the proliferation of I think that's the right word, how often you see near-death experiences with Jesus versus any other religious figure, even though the other religious figures do exist. Why does that happen? We're going to talk about theory about that later. That theory, as far as I know, seems to line up exactly with what you observe. In other words, truth of God, you're just curve fitting the data, right? So that's called, I think in mathematics or computer, numerical analysis is math that computers use. But it's just like a mathematical technique. If you take a whole bunch of data points about some phenomenon, you're trying to model the phenomena itself, you take a whole bunch of data points, you can create an equation that tends to fit, or if you graph the equation, it tends to look exactly like the points that you graphed, right? So it's called curve fitting, right? All you're doing in science is trying to make an equation that curve fits the data. It's exactly what they did with quantum phenomena, where they're trying to see the light emissions from, whatever objects or particles they were looking at, right? They're trying to make a mathematical model that explains the wavelengths of the electromagnetic radiation that they're observing, right? They're just curve fitting it, and they found they were able to do it with quantum mechanics, right? So it's the same principle here, because that's science, right? Same thing in sociology. If you have a certain, if you change it, if the neighborhood changes in a certain way, right? Certain people move in and, it starts to look run down, broken windows theory, and things like that, and you have flight of the more affluent people, and things like that, right? You can make certain predictions about timing, when this is going to happen, what factors motivate it, what factors cause it to happen more, things like that. And then you can have a sort of theory which curve fits the data that you graphed over like 30 years or something, right? That is what science is, right? It's just curve fitting the data. And when you have a theory about God and metaphysics and spirituality and things like that, you have a theory that you can't do it in math, but you have a theory that, in a qualitative way, curve fits the data nicely, right? And I argue that's exactly what the theory that we're going to set up does. And I've already done it to a degree with the subconscious in terms of emotion and creativity, right? So we have already done that, but we're going to do it in metaphysical and spiritual stuff. Based on what we talk about in the rest of the book. And that's your justification for believing. Atheists don't do that with anything, right? Because they're not scientific. So if they're not doing that, what right do they have to claim that anything they do is scientific? They don't, right? They just masquerade as science. And that's kind of why I want to make this video, because I want you guys to see through that. I always could since I was a kid. So that's never... Like I said, I always was like that. So I never really understood how other people didn't see atheists like that. I was going to say a double negative, but I have not seen them that way for my entire life. Not for 1 second Did I think they were anything more than this? Some sort of pseudoscience charlatan just trying to use flowery scientific language to try to masquerade their sort of nonsense anti-intellectual ideas. That's how I've always looked at them since I was a kid, every second of my life, right? It never deviated from that for 1 second, right? I almost think of it as like a salesman trying to hoodwink you. I could always see through that nonsense. You know what I mean? But some people can't. A lot of people are not like that. They don't really think about this stuff in that way, and so they may get swayed by these kind of silly nonsense arguments. But I just want to make these videos to kind of demonstrate to you that their arguments are nonsense. They're not scientific at all, right? They never have been. So in the next couple of chapters, we're going to look at this theory that I claim. Now, I am making a very large claim, right, about having a theory that curve fits the data related to God and Jesus Christ, things like that. And yes, right, I believe I have that. So when you study that throughout the remaining chapters and you learn how to have a relationship with God and speak to Him, you're going to start having supernatural experiences that just come out of nowhere. And you're going to realize that they're not just in your head and it's a magical hallucination that came that one time and never again for some reason, right, which is usually what happens. But you're going to recognize that what I'm saying is true. At least I believe you're going to start to see that. But yeah, that's it. So this is actually the last video of the chapter. And then the next chapter, we're going to begin chapter 3, which I'm going to go back to talking about the connection between the subconscious and God. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.